Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it is an honor today to rise to speak to this this important piece of legislation. I've been able to rise a couple times on throughout the debate towards this. I think my feelings towards this legislation, the importance of it, is widely known. Madam Speaker, as I receive a phone call, that's going to ruin the video that we're doing. Madam Speaker, the importance of this piece of legislation cannot be understated. It also is, again, incredible, as I said in my earlier question, that once again we're seeing time allocation on a piece of legislation that is so important. Madam Speaker, it is interesting that we get the same talking points from those on the government side about how they just need to rush this through, but I want to offer a very valuable piece of insight and why it's important that we have the fulsome debate here in this House. As a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, the Member of Parliament from Nunavut actually came by, and indeed himself had said that he had wished that he had had a chance to speak to the importance of this, the importance of it in his area. But he was not given the opportunity to do so because of what? Time allocation, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, regardless of how much they say this is an important piece of legislation, which we all are in agreement with it, they are forcing time allocation on it and shutting down debate, which again is a failure. Another campaign failure, promise failure by this Prime Minister. Madam Speaker, our language is a window into where we have been, into our past. It is a window to who we are today. And indeed, it is a window into who we are moving forward and who we may be moving forward. And I will bring you to back to the comments about residential schools and the 150,000 First Nations, the estimated 150,000 First Nations children that were ripped from their families, their clans, and their communities, and sent to these schools with the full intent to drive the Indian out of them. Madam Speaker, when we talk about residential schools, and I've shared this in my in this House at various times, just down the road from where my mom was living just recently was St. Joseph's Mission in Williams Lake. St. Joseph's Mission is it's the birthplace of Orange Shirt Day, where Phyllis Webstead Jack, or Phyllis Jack, talks about how her very first day of school, her grandmother had bought her a brand new orange shirt, and getting off the bus at St. Joseph's School, how that shirt and any of a semblance of any First Nations of her background was ripped from her. And they were forced to wear the uniforms of that, and they were not allowed to speak their traditional language. They were punished if they did. Madam Speaker, we are now only now beginning to understand what horrors took place in some of these institutions. I have also said that I was ashamed that I lived in the same community, and other friends of mine as well too. We lived just down the road from this school, and we had no idea as to the horrors that were taking place in our own community. Now, Speaker, it was in 1966, Mary Carpenter, a 23-year-old Inuk from Sax Harbor, Northwest Territories, that really started to shine the light on the atrocities that took place in our residential schools. And she did so before a television audience. She was appearing on the Pierre Burton show. She was a guest. And she wept as she spoke of the physical and mental abuse she suffered. And, Madam Speaker, it was a shock for the thousands of viewers who had for generations been fed the lie that forced assimilation was the answer to our Indian questions. Madam Speaker, there are 634 First Nations across our beautiful country. There are 50 distinct languages First Nations languages and many, many different dialects. In British Columbia, we have 34 unique First Nation languages and over 93 dialects. 2 weeks ago, I talked about Elder Mary Gucci, who in my community of Prince George, she was at every event, and she did whatever she could to try to, she was a keeper of the dialect, keeper of the language. She was one of three. Madam Speaker, I said one of four, she was one of three, and she passed away 3 weeks ago, taking with her the knowledge and the background of that culture and that language. Madam Speaker, that is a huge cultural loss to our community. I was fortunate enough, prior to being elected, to be part of the 2015 Canada Winter Games. I raised the money for that game. The Canada Games are taking place in Red Deer as we speak right now. And the Canada Games are about legacy. So as a host society and an executive host society, what we chose to do, we wanted to leave a legacy of not only sport within our community, but we wanted to leave a legacy of culture in our community. So we were the first host society to adopt a host First Nation, which was Cletli today. Madam Speaker, I forgot to start by saying Hadi, and that's how we say hello in Cletli. Madam Speaker, as a host society, we endeavored to go and actually make our, not bilingual, our games bilingual, we endeavored to make them trilingual. But there was a major challenge with that, Madam Speaker, is try to find the elders or those within the community that could help us translate simple wayfinding signs, or getting people around the table to try and figure out how we welcomed the nation to our community. But Madam Speaker, I'm happy to say that all across our community now that we have an amazing relationship with our Cletli T'enneh, which is our host First Nation in our community. Chief Domo and his community is a great leader within our community. But that host First Nation flag still flies at City Hall, flies at many of our major government buildings as well too. But Madam Speaker, in 2017, National Geographic said that BC is a hotbed and at threat of actually losing First Nations language at a staggering rate. Sorry, it was in 2007. It said that we are at risk of language extinction, with many Aboriginal dialects classed as endangered or moribund, meaning that most fluent speakers were over 60. And indeed, we now know that most of the fluent speakers in our British Columbia First Nation languages and dialects are over 52. Or sorry, they're 52% are over 60, which means we are losing that knowledge. And Speaker, I also have talked about the importance to the First Nations language to my community, or to my family, as my son and my daughter and my wife are First Nations, and they are not connected to their community. They don't know the language. They don't know the culture. And while we have tried to, be part of the community, it's the language is, as you can imagine, it's very hard and very difficult to learn. And Speaker, C91 is an important piece of legislation. I have a minute left, and such an important piece of legislation. I wish that all of our colleagues that they all had the opportunity to speak at this piece of legislation. C91 is an important piece of legislation. It is so important. As I said earlier, our language is our window into our past. It is a window into who we are today, and it is a window into our future. There is a lost generation that is out there because the languages and their culture were driven from them, Madam Speaker. And it would be, with such an important piece of legislation, I think we need to get this right, Madam Speaker. And I humbly cede the floor with that, and I offer to my colleagues across the way, this is a very important piece of legislation. It's not one that we should be rushing. We should be spending the time and making sure that First Nations communities from coast to coast to coast to coast our representative in this study. Thank you.